Al Capone in 22 minutes. Al Capone, born on the 17th of January 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, grew up in a family of Italian immigrants. His father, Gabriel Capone, and mother Teresa Capone worked hard to raise their 9 children in a tough neighborhood. They settled in Brooklyn after emigrating from Italy and faced the challenges of adapting to a new life. As a young student, Capone showed promise and made his parents proud with his excellent academic results. However, he struggled to conform to the strict rules of his Catholic upbringing and was eventually expelled from school at the age of 14. At the age of 14, a female teacher. This incident marked the beginning of his education in the world of crime. Surrounded by criminal influences that were prevalent in Brooklyn at the time, it was inevitable that Capone would be drawn into gang life. He started with small-time gangs like the 40 Thieves before progressing to the Brooklyn Rippers and eventually joining the infamous 5 Points Gang, which held great power in Lower Manhattan. In 1917, Capone found employment and guidance under Frankie Yale, a bootlegger and protection racketeer. Working at Yale's bar, the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, Capone learned about the criminal underworld while tending bar and serving as a doorman. During this time, he also encountered influential figures like Johnny Torrio, whom he admired and saw as a mentor. It was during a brawl at the Harvard Inn that Capone gained his notorious nickname, Scarface. After insulting a man named Frankie Galluccio, Capone was attacked with a knife, leaving a visible scar on his face. Despite his desire for revenge, Capone eventually reconciled with Galluccio. Recognizing his own fault in the matter and understanding the importance of family respect and loyalty in the gangster world, family played a significant role in Capone's life, and he married his girlfriend May Josephine Conklin in December 1918. They had a son named Albert Francis Sonny Capone. Shortly after their marriage, Capone relocated to Chicago at the request of his friend Johnny Torrio. In Chicago, he became involved in organized crime and worked as a bouncer in a brothel. Unfortunately, Capone contracted syphilis but failed to seek treatment until it was too late. The surge of organized crime in the 1920s was largely fueled by the demand for alcohol during the Prohibition era. Despite the ban on alcohol, many people, particularly those of Italian and Irish heritage, continued to consume it. This created a massive black market which benefited the criminal underworld, including Capone's gang, the Chicago Outfit. They profited from the illegal production and distribution of alcohol, using bribes and violence to maintain their control. Meanwhile, Capone's personal life in Chicago was relatively stable. He purchased a house and established himself as a boxing promoter. However, his real work involved operating within a crime organization headed by Johnny Torrio, who had taken over from James Big Jim Colosimo as the leading crime boss in Chicago. At the height of Prohibition, Capone's gang grew rapidly, establishing illegal stills, breweries, and a network for transporting alcohol, including reaching Canada. They relied on bribery and intimidation to protect their operations, resorting to bombings and violence against businesses that refused to comply. The estimate is that up to 100 people were killed in such attacks during the 1920s. Al Capone had a taste for the finer things in life. He indulged in expensive suits, cigars, gourmet food, and the company of women. Adorned with flashy jewelry, he basked in the attention and even received cheers from crowds at ball games. In his mind, he saw himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, using his illicit wealth to make charitable donations. He cunningly justified his activities by claiming to merely satisfy the public's demand. In 1923, a political reform movement emerged with the appointment of Mayor William Emmett Deaver in Chicago. To avoid scrutiny, Capone and his mentor, Torrio, relocated their operations to the suburban town of Cicero, Illinois. Establishing brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens, they expanded their liquor business to supply all the saloons in Cicero. Through bribery and intimidation, they even influenced local elections, such as the 1924 municipal elections. By projecting an appearance of respectability, Capone shielded himself from rival gangs and hindered the rise of reformist politicians. The corrupt Republican mayor of Cicero, Joseph Klenner collaborated with Capone's gang to secure his re-election. On April 1, 1924, the day of the election, Capone's gang unleashed a wave of violence, including stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and intimidation. Their aim was to ensure Klenner's victory and maintain control over Cicero. The terror began on May 31, the eve of the election, when the Democratic nominee for town clerk, William K. Palmer, was brutally assaulted and his offices were vandalized. Campaign workers were attacked, voters were targeted, and ballot thefts were rampant. Some victims were shot, stabbed, or beaten on the streets. The gangsters employed various tactics such as tying up and gagging campaign officials and forcibly preventing them from voting. The situation grew so dire that Judge Edmund K. Jaracki dispatched 70 police officers to restore order. In the midst of the chaos, a confrontation unfolded between Capone's associates and the police. Gunfire erupted, resulting in the death of Capone's brother, Frank Capone, while another associate, Dave Headland, was wounded. Capone himself managed to escape, but Charles Fischetti, his cousin, later surrendered. Such encounters were occupational hazards for Capone, who faced numerous attempts on his life from rival gang members and the constant threat of arrest. In the early 1920s, Al Capone's driver was brutally murdered, and he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in downtown Chicago. Following the death of his friend Johnny Torrio, Capone assumed a new role as a negotiator in gang disputes, earning a reputation as an arbitrator. He brokered deals that ensured Torrio's Italian crime group remained the city's most dominant. One notable deal Capone arranged involved the control of territory between the North Side Gang and the Jenner brothers. Torrio's alliance with the Jenners led to Dean O'Banion, the North Side Gang leader, being targeted. O'Banion's murder took place at his flower shop, which served as a front for illicit activities. Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale, along with Albert Anselmi and John Scalise from the Jenner gang, carried out the hit on O'Banion while he was arranging chrysanthemums. In January 1925, Capone himself was ambushed but survived the attack. Shortly after, Torrio was shot, prompting him to step down and hand control of the Chicago outfit to Capone, who was only 26 years old at the time. The North Side Gang continued its relentless pursuit, launching another assault in September 1926. Gunmen fired more than 1,000 shots at a restaurant where Capone was present, but he managed to escape unharmed. Recognizing the need for enhanced security, Capone began spending more time away from Chicago, taking luxurious vacations under false names and acquiring properties discreetly, such as a mansion in Miami. Despite his notorious reputation, Capone was also known for his charitable contributions. During the Great Depression, he helped establish a soup kitchen in Chicago. He leveraged his political connections, including supporting William Hale Thompson's mayoral campaign, as he knew Thompson's victory would favor his bootlegging business by allowing the reopening of illegal drinking establishments. In 1927, Capone continued to support Thompson, who defeated William Emmett Deaver in the mayoral race. Their alliance remained strong until 1929. However, after the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre, where Bugs Moran's gang members were ruthlessly killed, Capone's illicit activities were exposed. His informal immunity from prosecution, secured through his association with Thompson, began to crumble. Moran was among Al Capone's most despised adversaries, and their rivalry was marked by a series of retaliatory killings and violence. Moran strongly disapproved of Capone's involvement in prostitution, which contradicted his Catholic principles. On February 14, 1929, the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre took place. Prior to the event, Capone rented an apartment across from Moran's headquarters, meticulously observing his men's movements. Capone orchestrated a phone call to Moran, feigning an offer for a discounted whiskey delivery from Detroit the following day. Moran agreed to the arrangement, setting the meeting for 10:30 a.m. at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where his bootlegging vehicles were stored. Upon the truck's arrival, Capone orchestrated a staged police raid. two gunmen disguised as plainclothes officers, accompanied by two others dressed as Chicago police officers, lined up 7 of Moran's men against a wall under the pretense of conducting a search. However, upon a predetermined signal, the accomplices unleashed a hail of bullets from machine guns and shotguns, mercilessly gunning down the helpless men. Remarkably, Moran himself narrowly escaped the attack by oversleeping that morning, despite being the primary target. The repercussions of the massacre tarnished Capone's public image and standing, particularly after photographs of the slain victims circulated. He was subsequently branded public enemy number 1, leading to public scrutiny regarding his close association with Mayor Thompson of Chicago. In the aftermath of the attack, Moran violated the gangster's code and revealed Capone's involvement to the police. This resulted in Capone being summoned to court to face charges. However, he skillfully evaded accountability by claiming illness and, therefore, being unable to attend court proceedings. This strategy worked twice, ultimately resulting in the charges against him being dropped. Although Capone was known for delegating his violent acts to others, there is a particular story that suggests his direct involvement. According to this account, Capone personally assaulted several of his men with a baseball bat after a night of drinking, subsequently ordering his associates to shoot them. In 1929, Al Capone, known as Public Enemy Number 1, faced intensifying law enforcement scrutiny. On March 27 of that year, he was arrested by FBI agents after testifying to a grand jury investigating violations of prohibition laws. The charges brought against him related to his feigned illness used as a tactic to evade previous prosecution. On May 16, 1929, Capone was arrested once again in Philadelphia, this time for carrying a concealed weapon. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Capone entered Eastern State Penitentiary on August 8, 1929, and was released in March 1930. However, his troubles continued in April 1930 when he was arrested on vagrancy charges while visiting Miami Beach. The governor ordered his expulsion from the state. During the arrest, Capone claimed that the police had threatened his family and denied him food and water, resulting in additional perjury charges. After a 3-day trial in July, he was found not guilty. In September, a court judge issued another warrant for Capone's arrest on vagrancy charges. The judge then ran against Mayor Thompson in the Republican primary election, capitalizing on the publicity surrounding Capone's case to garner votes. In February 1931, Al Capone found himself facing another trial, this time for contempt of court due to his claims of illness. Judge James Herbert Wilkinson took it upon himself to question Capone's doctor's testimony, aligning with the prosecutor. Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but remained free temporarily as he appealed the decision. The law was determined to bring him to justice by any means necessary. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt recognized that there might be an alternative method to hold the gangsters accountable. She observed that the lavish lifestyles of mobsters required a substantial income, yet they never filed income tax returns. Willebrandt devised a strategy to prosecute them for tax evasion, allowing convictions without relying on the challenging acquisition of testimony regarding other illegal activities and violent crimes. This approach was put to the test in the case of United States versus Manly Sullivan, an illegal bootlegger. The result of the case was a ruling by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. that illegally earned income should be subject to income tax, and the plea of the Fifth Amendment to protect criminals from reporting illegal income was deemed invalid. Subsequently, the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, appointed Frank J. Wilson to investigate Capone's tax matters. Capone instructed his lawyers to rectify his tax situation, and they declared taxable income of $100,000 for each year of 1928 and 1929. As he had not paid taxes on that amount, the declaration effectively constituted an admission of guilt. On March 13, 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for the year 1924, and on June 5, he was indicted on 22 counts of income tax evasion from 1925 to 1929 by a federal grand jury. he was released on bail of $50,000. Shortly after, Elliot Ness and his team became involved in the legal proceedings, and their evidence led to Capone's indictment on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, which detailed the prohibition laws. Ness and his team diligently investigated Capone's bootlegging operations, collecting evidence of conspiracy to violate the national prohibition of Volstead Act. They conducted raids on his illegal stills and breweries, effectively disrupting his supply chain and causing an estimated loss of $9 million in income. Using wiretaps on phone lines, Ness's team gathered evidence for the 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act that would form the basis of Capone's trial. On June 16, 1931, Capone appeared before Judge James Herbert Wilkinson and pleaded guilty to income tax evasion and the 5,000 Volstead Act violations as part of a plea bargain. In exchange, he agreed to a sentence of 2.5 years. However, during the sentencing phase, Judge Wilkinson reneged on the plea bargain. On July 30, 1931, Capone's lawyers withdrew the guilty pleas, arguing that a lawyer cannot confess on behalf of a client. They contended that the lawyers had admitted to the income, not Capone himself. Despite the objection, Judge Wilkinson overruled it, asserting that any statement made to a government official was done at one's own risk. Subsequently, Capone stood trial solely on the charges of income tax evasion, and his lawyers had minimal time to prepare. Their defense centered around the claim that all of Capone's income had been lost due to his gambling habits. However, this defense proved weak, as gambling losses were only deductible from gambling winnings, and Capone's expenses indicated the availability of funds to cover them. The extent of all Capone's extravagant spending came under scrutiny in court, revealing that he had evaded $215,000 in taxes on a gross income of $1,038,600 of $1,038,654 over a 5-year period. On October 31, 1931, Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. A week later, his sentence was pronounced: 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and additional costs. He would also be responsible for paying the $215,000 in back taxes, plus interest. However, the sentence for contempt of court would be served concurrently. In response, Capone assembled a team of expert lawyers specializing in habeas corpus law to investigate the lawfulness of his detention. They based their argument on a Supreme Court ruling that deemed tax evasion distinct from fraud and potentially subject to time limitations for prosecution. However, the judge determined that the time Capone spent in Miami should be deducted from the age of the offenses, rendering the argument invalid. Consequently, his appeal for both conviction and sentence was denied, and at the age of 33, Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on May 3, 1932. Despite being proficient at his job of stitching soles onto shoes, Capone faced hostility from fellow inmates. They viewed him as a weak individual, unable to handle the bullying, and believed he received preferential treatment. This perception stemmed from the protection offered by his cellmate, Red Rudensky, an experienced criminal associated with the Southside Gang. Due to the animosity Capone encountered from other inmates and concerns about his mental well-being, it was decided that he would be transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in August 1934. His new cell was designated as Cell 180, 1 in Alcatraz. On June 23, 1936, Al Capone experienced an attack in the laundry area of the prison carried out by fellow inmate James Critter Tan Lucas, a convicted bank robber. Lucas managed to stab Capone in the back using a pair of stolen scissors, but the injury was only superficial. Capone swiftly retaliated by throwing Lucas against a wall, and as a consequence, Lucas was placed in solitary confinement as punishment. During his stay at Alcatraz, Capone's syphilis worsened, affecting his mental state. In February 1938, he received a formal diagnosis of syphilis of the brain. As a result, his last year at Alcatraz was spent in the prison's hospital ward, where he experienced disorientation and confusion. Following his release from Alcatraz on January 6, 1939, Capone was immediately transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to serve his sentence for contempt of court. Eventually, on November 16, 1939, he was granted parole after his wife, May, appealed to the court, citing his diminished mental capacity. The impact of Capone's imprisonment was depicted by those involved as a reduction in the operations of organized crime carried out by the Southside mob. However, the reality was that it merely necessitated a temporary change in leadership, which was filled by Frank Nitti during Capone's time in prison for tax evasion. After his release, the Chicago outfit, under new leadership, adopted a more discreet approach to avoid attracting attention. Although they continued engaging in illegal activities such as prostitution, gambling, and loan sharking, they curtailed the level of violence associated with Capone's reign. Even after the end of Prohibition, they maintained their operations while operating covertly. Upon his release, Capone sought medical treatment at Union Memorial Hospital in Baltimore due to his deteriorating health. In gratitude to Union Memorial, Capone donated Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital. Returning to Palm Island, Capone became one of the early recipients of penicillin in the United States, which helped slow down the progression of his illness. Assessments by a Baltimore psychiatrist and his personal physician revealed that his mental age had regressed to that of a 12-year-old. Capone's health further deteriorated as he suffered a stroke and contracted bronchopneumonia, which ultimately led to a cardiac arrest. On January 25, 1947, he passed away at home, surrounded by loved ones. A private funeral took place in Chicago a week later, and he was initially laid to rest at Mount Olivet Cemetery. However, his remains were later transferred to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Following Capone's death, the Chicago outfit continued their criminal activities, expanding their influence to states like Florida and California. Even today, Capone's legend persists, with his image and characterization often used to represent the archetypal American gangster. Al Capone's life and the organization he led were characterized by controversy. While some view him as a modern-day Robin Hood, others perceive him as a ruthless tax evader, murderer, and gangster. The interpretation of Capone's legacy is left to individual judgment,